Good evening, friends. Thanks to the sponsors of tonight's event for inviting me. And thanks to Professor Craig for participating, and thanks to all of you for coming out. So, Professor Craig went first and got to give his case for theism. Going second, I'm now expected to present my position, argue it, and dismantle his. So I better get going. I call the position 21st century atheism. Why 21st century? Because I think we've learned some important lessons in the 20th century about philosophy of religion, and it's time to take advantage of those insights. Next. Let's define the position first. We should be formulating theism and atheism in terms of confidence levels, from 0% to 100%, not in terms of belief. Confidence levels are much more precise. For example, if forced to answer who would be the next president, I'd probably say Hillary Clinton, but I'm only at about 51% confidence on that. So there's no way that I would say sincerely Hillary is going to win in normal circumstances. A certain level of confidence is required in order to count as a belief. We should formulate theism and atheism in terms of specific gods or religions. The terms theist about X and atheist about X should be primary. And then you can define general theism and general atheism in terms of those. We also need to distinguish between weak religious views and strong religious views. A weak religious view is greater than 50% confidence. A strong religious view is high enough to count as knowledge or outright belief. So using these points, we can map out the various options. Next. On the left, we see views on whether some God exists. Here I've put in the threshold for belief at 80%, but that's just an example. Saying that it's more probable than not that some God exists means that you only need to show greater than 50% confidence. But saying that we know or believe that some God exists requires a higher confidence level. Next, top and the bottom indicate strong positions. The top, strong theism. The bottom, strong atheism. Next. The middle positions are in between, and they are weak. Just above the 50%, we have weak theism. Just below 50%, weak atheism. Next. Now on the right, we have the same kind of options, but instead of being about whether there's any gods at all, they're about whether capital G God, the Christian God, exists. And now back to both frameworks. Here we have, next, 21st century atheism depicted on the previous framework as the red X on the left and the red X on the right. The left X indicates that it's more probable than not that there are no gods at all. The right X indicates that that there is no Christian God, and that's a high confidence claim. You can imagine a bunch of frameworks just like the one on the right for other sorts of gods like Zeus or Thor or what have you, and the X is going to be in the same place in each case. Okay. So 21st century atheism is a fairly simple theory, and the primary argument for it is fairly simple as well. I call it the confidence argument. For any familiar God, including capital G God, the evidence is always either in ancient history or someplace where there are few witnesses, or it's based on someone's private experience. Also, the evidence for it conflicts with our best scientific theories in biology, chemistry, and physics. And we should have way more confidence in those scientific theories than in any existing evidence for any familiar God. The confidence argument should give us high enough confidence to say God does not exist, Zeus does not exist, Thor does not exist, and so on. But what about our confidence for the claim that there are no gods at all? Any God that supposedly intervenes in the world in any familiar way is going to be undermined by the confidence argument. And we have no reason to believe in gods that do not intervene in the world at all because they don't need them to explain anything. So there's no reason to think that they do exist, and there's very weak reason to believe they do not exist. Therefore, it's more probable than not that there are no gods. But this confidence isn't high enough to count as knowledge or outright belief. Next. That's my position and my arguments for it. It's important to note that 21st century atheism has nothing to do with the following views. No strong general theism. That would require arguing for high confidence against the existence of all conceivable gods, even those that might want to deceive us about all the evidence, like Descartes' evil deceiver. Defending strong general atheism is, in my view, a sucker's bet. No reductive naturalism. I have no patience with the claim that everything can be reductively explained in terms of science, and it's completely independent of 21st century atheism. I have not argued that religion has bad consequences. I have not implied that theists are stupid. Professor Craig might be the smartest person in the room for all I know. I have not argued that miracles are impossible, only that all the evidence we have for them does not override or even come close to our evidence for scientific theories that conflict with the supposed miracle. Now I want to develop a new kind of criticism of arguments for theism and for Christianity. I call it the appeal to divine psychology. You might have noticed I didn't use the problem of evil in my arguments here at all. That's because contemporary Christian philosophers of religion, to their great credit, have largely dismantled the problem of evil. In essence, the theist points out that we should have no confidence at all in understanding God's global plans, or how the evil we see might be outweighed by some more important part of the plan. Then the argument turns into a fight about divine psychology. By divine psychology, I mean what God would do, what God would believe, what God would want, what plans God would have, or what reasons God would have. Arguing with a theist about divine psychology is like arguing with a little kid about his imaginary tea party, and all the parents in the room know that you don't win that argument. No one seems to have realized that the point can be generalized to show that an entire category of arguments is unacceptable. That entire category I call appeals to divine psychology, and it includes many of the theists' favorite arguments as well. Abandoning divine psychology cuts both ways, but it cuts the theist deeper. In particular, cosmological arguments, teleological arguments, explanatory arguments, and miracle arguments all make appeals to divine psychology. The Christian might claim that appeals to divine psychology are just fine, but the theist can't have it both ways. If we allow claims about God's psychology, then the problem of evil comes roaring right back, and you don't want that. Now we need to turn to the arguments for theism and for Christianity in particular. Because my discussion partner is Professor Craig, I'll be focusing on his work and what follows. In assessing his arguments, I will talk as I would to any other professional philosopher whose system I've managed to work my way into. That is, I don't pull punches, but I also never attack character, so it isn't personal. Professor Craig knows this, I know this, I'm saying it for the benefit of the audience. In part because I respect the guy. He's got some great philosophical skills, he's a talented system builder, which I admire, and he's done a tremendous service to the atheist movement by trouncing most of our heroes and raising the bar on both sides. I'm serious. That's a major benefit, a major thing that we can say thank you for. I've managed to take a look at Professor Craig's entire system. Here it is. Here's what we have. I think all the major arguments that are here that Professor Craig has either advocated or proposed over the years. It's divided into arguments for theism in general at the top and for Christianity in particular at the bottom. Recall, he just gave the contingency argument, the kalam argument, the mathematical applicability argument, the fine-tuning argument, the moral argument, and the experience argument. 4 arguments from the top, 2 arguments from the bottom. That's the 6 he just gave. Next. In this table, Professor Craig's arguments are on the left and some major problems are on the top. Next. We can see first a previously unknown problem that affects the entire system. I call it the weakness problem. It's sort of highlighted in blue up there. Professor Craig has routinely defended these arguments for theism by saying that he only needs to convince you that the premises are more plausible than not. But it should be obvious that it takes more than 51% confidence for knowledge or outright belief. Look back at the earlier framework for illustration. Here is what Professor Craig argues for. These are the way his arguments are presented. Next. These are the conclusions that he draws from them. Go back. Those are the way he defends his premises. And again, forward. Those are the conclusions. So, ultimately, he's been defending his arguments as if he advocates weak theism. But he's been advertising his view as if it's strong theism. So the weakness problem is that his arguments are far weaker than they need to be to support his very strong conclusions. Therefore, no one should take any of these arguments seriously until they are completely redefended from the ground up to match the standard Professor Craig has set for himself. Otherwise, he could backpedal and opt for weak theism, but either way, the entire system needs to be reworked. While there are plenty of interesting things to say, I don't really need to do any more to undermine the entire system of arguments with the exception of the experience argument at the bottom. It doesn't have any X's at all, but don't let that fool you. That just makes it very different from the other ones. I do want to emphasize a couple of points. Look at the divine psychology objection. The problem affects a lot of the arguments up here, and it's not going to affect the moral argument, but everyone except for moral and experience of the ones that he presented, it's there. Next, think about explanation. Professor Craig routinely formulates his arguments as inferences to the best explanation. I don't know if you noticed that, but every single one of the first 5 arguments were formulated as inferences to the best explanation tonight. However, he admits that it's almost impossible to determine what God would do or plan at all. For example, if we think of God alone existing all by himself, then there's no way to infer that God would even create the universe. Professor Craig freely admits that the God hypothesis doesn't make any predictions, but it also makes no retrodictions. A retrodiction is like a prediction, but it's predicting something that we already know about, like the existence of the universe. The God hypothesis offers no predictions, no retrodictions, and as such, it's a terrible explanation. Moral argument. The first premise states that if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist either. In arguing for this premise, Professor Craig just assumes that the atheist has to explain all morality in terms of evolutionary theory. He said it again tonight. But that is so completely wrong that you can't know anything about the whole history of ethics over the last century if you espouse that. There are literally dozens of theories of moral values and moral duties that are objective, not naturalist, and make no appeal to gods. For example, G.E. Moore, Sir William David Ross, Christine Korsgaard, Thomas Scanlon, Derek Parfit, Philippa Foot, David Enoch, Russ Schaefer Landau, Rosalind Hershouse, John McDowell, Jonathan Dancy, H.A. Pritchard, Roger Crisp, Joseph Raz, Gene Hampton, and Rafe Wedgwood. That's just a few. Therefore, until he's refuted every single one of these theories, he needs to stop using the moral argument. The lesson for everybody else, stop assuming that atheists cannot accept that there are objective moral values. All it demonstrates is that you know nothing about ethics. Next. Finally, Professor Craig makes a big deal of his knowledge of cosmology, and he uses it in the Kalam argument and the fine-tuning argument, both arguments that you saw tonight. However, he rejects evolutionary theory and with it contemporary biology in favor of intelligent design, which is the idea that biological species developed by God's guidance. But it doesn't make sense to claim to be an expert on cosmology and at the same time reject evolution. That's just cherry picking. Does he think there's a magic dividing line between biology and chemistry? How do you think the fine-tuning argument even works? Those calculations are about biochemistry, and that's the basis for evolutionary theory and biology. At this point, we understand life well enough that if you reject evolutionary theory, it's pretty easy to trace out how you would have to reject chemistry and ultimately physics as well. So, Professor Craig, from one philosopher to another, please drop intelligent design. I would like to have a stronger opponent than that. It does nothing to help you, and it makes you look like you're more scared of evolutionary theory than Richard Dawkins is scared of you. And we both know that's pretty scared. We don't need to go through much more, partly because for the apologist, these arguments are just smoke and mirrors anyway, and as we'll see, their fate has no impact on the apologist's belief that God exists. The real heart of the system is the experience argument. We'll turn to that. Professor Craig claims that even if all the other arguments for God's existence were shown to be worthless, that would have absolutely zero impact on his belief that God exists. That's because his own religious experience tells him that he knows God exists independently of any argument or evidence. He makes 2 appeals to justify this radical thesis. First, the belief that God exists is a basic belief because it's like a perceptual belief. And second, that his religious experience is an intrinsic defeater. This means that his experience is so powerful that it undermines any reason one might have to doubt it. So according to Professor Craig, his religious experience is so powerful, it allows him to know God exists, it can never be reasonably doubted, and he doesn't have to provide any arguments for it at all. You gotta hand it to the guy, he knows where his weak spot is. The fact is, religious experiences do not fit well into basic structure because they don't act like perceptual experiences at all. Perceptual experiences are backed up by other evidence, including biology. Not so for religious experience. And in addition, we've got very good reason to think that there are no intrinsic defeaters, because any experience can be misleading. Indeed, we can stimulate a person's brain in certain ways and cause them to have very powerful religious experiences, even though they aren't experiencing anything. If Professor Craig's experience was truly an intrinsic defeater, it would have to defeat all of neuroscience that potentially undermines it, and that's absurd. Subjective experiences, even really powerful ones, are just that, subjective. All by themselves, they don't allow us to know anything objective. By far the biggest problem with the experience argument is that it's supposed to justify being an apologist, which is how Professor Craig identifies. The apologist is concerned first and foremost with defending the belief that God exists. There's never an attempt to figure out whether it's true that God exists, and the apologist is completely opposed to even considering that God might not exist. I am ready to become a Christian tonight. But Professor Craig, because he's an apologist, has decided to put becoming an atheist completely out of the question. The apologist puts this belief that God exists completely out of bounds for critical thinking. Being an apologist is seriously irrational. First of all, putting any belief completely out of bounds for critical thinking is irrational. How irrational? Well, we have lots of great theories of rationality and critical thinking, but none of them can even model the apologist's irrationality. For example, you might be able to come close if you stipulate that the belief in God has to be 100% confidence, but Professor Craig emphatically denies that. So he's suggesting that we should take a belief that isn't even certain and put it out of bounds for critical thinking. Our best theories of rationality can account for a lot of kinds of irrationality, but the apologist's irrationality is so extreme that it can't even be modeled at all. Being an apologist is off the charts irrational. When discussing the case of Ryan Bell, the pastor who tried atheism for a year and lost his faith, Professor Craig freely admits that any Christian who allows Christianity to be subject to critical thinking, just like any other belief, is probably going to end up an atheist. That's Professor Craig's own stated view. The greatest Christian apologist of the last half-century is convinced that if the Christian gives the belief that God exists a fair shake in the process of rational belief revision, then the belief that God exists is going to lose. Let that sink in for a second. Finally, why should we care about any of this? Well, it has a huge impact on social issues. In particular, apologetics tends to creep into related beliefs and lead to arbitrary hatefulness. For example, Professor Craig campaigns against same-sex marriage and the right for same-sex couples to adopt. To try to undermine some perfectly great parents' right to have kids is a personal disgrace, and moreover, it's not supported by anything in the Bible or entailed by anything that is. Of course, there's no outcry about single people adopting kids, nor is there an outcry about rich people adopting kids, even though greed is mentioned right along with homosexuality in 1 Corinthians and is emphasized over and over throughout the New Testament. When Professor Craig cites evidence for his view, he focuses exclusively on the 4 studies that suggest some problems for kids from same-sex households. Conveniently, he ignores the over 70 studies concluding that there are no problems specific to kids from same-sex households. Professor Craig, don't forget, you can always change your mind. Thank you.